It was the kind of trip I had always dreamed of. A solo camping adventure deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. No distractions, no crowds, just me and the quiet embrace of nature. It wasn't the first time I'd gone camping alone, but there was something about this particular trip that felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air felt heavier, as though it was filled with secrets waiting to be uncovered. I'd been planning this trip for months. It was late October, the weather was cool but not freezing, and the leaves on the trees had started to change, painting the forest in vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows. I had mapped out the trail myself, a secluded spot near a river where few people ventured. I wanted to experience true solitude. No other campers, no other hikers, just the woods and me. Setting up camp was easier than I expected. I'd learned over the years how to set up my tent quickly and efficiently. After an hour, I had my campfire going, the warm glow flickering in the growing dusk. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the silence, and I couldn't help but think how peaceful everything was. The kind of peace you only find when you're truly alone. I sat there for a while, staring into the flames, feeling the warmth on my skin and the cool breeze against my face. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and I retreated into my tent to get some sleep. The faint rustling of the trees outside, combined with the steady chirp of crickets, lulled me into a sense of calm. But somewhere during the night, I woke up. It wasn't anything drastic, just a slight shift in my awareness. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I wasn't sure why I was awake. The night was dead quiet, too quiet. My mind, foggy with sleep, immediately tried to rationalize it. The wind had probably stopped blowing, I thought, or maybe an animal was lurking nearby. I could hear the subtle shifting of branches, but there was something off about it, something out of place. I tried to settle back into the warmth of my sleeping bag, but it felt like the silence was pressing down on me, suffocating me. There was no breeze, no animal sounds, nothing, just the echo of my own breath. I glanced at my watch. It was 3 a.m., deep into the night. I tried to ignore the creeping unease and focused on the rhythm of my breathing. Then I heard it, a sharp snap, a twig breaking. It was so sudden that my heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the sound. It had come from somewhere behind the tent, deeper in the woods. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The snapping of a twig was common in the forest, especially this time of year when the ground was covered in dead leaves. But then I heard another snap, followed by a low, almost inaudible sound. A rustle, like something was moving through the underbrush. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I held my breath, trying to be as still as possible, hoping whatever it was wouldn't notice me. My hand instinctively reached for the flashlight I kept by my side, but I didn't dare turn it on. I knew the moment I did, the beam of light would give me away, and I didn't know what I was dealing with. The rustling continued, and my mind started to race. What if it wasn't an animal? What if it was someone else out here? I tried to push the thought out of my head, but the possibility lingered, making my skin crawl. There was no one around for miles, no other campers or hikers, so the idea of another person out here felt wrong. The rustling stopped, and for a long time, I didn't hear anything. Not a single sound. It was as though the forest itself had gone silent, holding its breath. Then, just when I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing, the sound came again. A sharp crack of a branch, followed by the unmistakable sound of something. Someone moving slowly, deliberately, through the underbrush. At that point, I couldn't stay still anymore. My heart was racing, and my thoughts were spinning. I slowly, carefully unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground, but I saw nothing. The woods were dark, still. There was no sign of movement. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, straining my ears for any sound, any indication that I wasn't alone. But the longer I sat in that silence, the more I realized that something was off. I could feel it in my bones. It wasn't just the isolation of being in the woods alone. It was something else, something unnatural. I made the decision to leave. I didn't know why, but the feeling of being watched was overpowering. I started packing up my tent quietly, trying not to make any noise. My hands were shaking as I folded the tent and stuffed everything back into my backpack. Every rustle of the trees above me seemed louder than it should have been. My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, but none of them made any sense. As I finished packing, I noticed something. The ground around my campsite was undisturbed. The area near my fire was empty, just as I'd left it. But as my eyes scanned the surrounding woods, I saw something that made my stomach turn. There, just beyond the edge of my camp, was a set of footprints. They were large, deep, and unmistakably human. The thing that unsettled me most was that they were fresh, too fresh. The ground was soft, and the impressions hadn't been there when I set up camp earlier that day. Whoever had left those prints was close, too close for comfort. I froze, staring at the tracks. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. My mind raced, thinking of all the ways I could get out of there, all the scenarios that could play out if I stayed. The air was thick now, heavy with tension. I had to leave. I had no choice. Every instinct told me to pack up and get out of the woods as fast as possible. I zipped up my bag and slung it over my shoulder, moving as quietly as I could. I turned to leave the campsite, trying not to look back at the tracks that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I forced myself to keep walking, to keep moving. I didn't look back until I was far enough away from the campsite that I felt safe. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone, but the trees were beginning to thin out, and I could see the faint outline of the river in the distance. I reached a small clearing where I finally stopped to catch my breath. My legs were sore, my heart pounding in my chest. It was then that I heard it. A voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. It was the sound of someone whispering, and it came from the direction of my campsite. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the road, and even then, I didn't feel safe. It wasn't until I was back in the safety of my car that I allowed myself to breathe a sigh of relief. The woods, which had seemed so inviting and peaceful just hours earlier, now felt like a dark, threatening place. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me the entire time. I don't know who was out there in the woods with me, and I don't know why they were so close. But I do know one thing: I will never camp alone again. I never should have gone alone. That was the first thought that crossed my mind as I trudged through the dense forest, the weight of my pack on my shoulders, the cool evening air biting at my exposed skin. It had seemed like such a good idea at the time. A weekend trip, a way to get away from the noise and stress of everyday life, a chance to be alone with nature, to hear nothing but the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird calling out from high above. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon and the shadows in the forest grew longer, I started to feel a growing unease. The woods had always been a place of calm for me, until now. I had grown up hiking, camping, and exploring the forests near my home. I knew how to read the terrain, how to track the weather, how to set up a tent and build a fire. I was used to the stillness of the forest at night, but this was different. There was something off about these woods. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisted and gnarled, like fingers reaching out from the darkness. Or maybe it was the way the sounds of the forest seemed to have muted, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for something. I had been walking for hours, lost in thought and too focused on the path ahead of me to notice how far off the trail I had wandered. The map I had brought with me was useless now. I hadn't seen any familiar landmarks for what felt like forever. I had hoped to find a nice, secluded spot to set up camp for the night, but now the darkness was swallowing everything around me. The trees were so thick that even the fading light of the sun barely filtered through. I knew I had to make camp soon or risk being caught out here after dark. I had planned on a simple camping trip, a few nights in a quiet spot, a warm meal, a peaceful sleep under the stars. But now, as the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that felt almost deliberate, I was starting to question my decision. The forest felt wrong. It was as if it was alive, watching me, waiting for something. I came across a small clearing, the ground covered in a thick blanket of pine needles and moss. It was the perfect place to set up camp, I thought, even though my gut told me I should keep moving. The campfire would provide some light and warmth, and it would be a good spot to rest. There was a small stream nearby, its water trickling softly, the sound comforting in the otherwise oppressive silence. I set up my tent as quickly as I could, my hands shaking slightly as I worked. The sky was already darkening, the first stars beginning to show through the canopy of trees. I gathered some firewood from around the clearing, trying not to listen to the way the forest seemed to creak and groan around me. There were no birds calling anymore, no small animals scurrying through the underbrush. It felt like the entire forest had gone still. The fire was small at first, but I fed it more wood until it crackled and burned brightly, casting dancing shadows on the trees around me. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to push away the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The heat from the fire was comforting, but the shadows it cast seemed to grow longer with every passing minute. My mind wandered back to the trail I had left behind, wondering if I had gone too far off the path. Maybe I should have just turned back when I had the chance. But that thought was soon replaced with the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was a subtle feeling at first, like a shift in the air, a slight disturbance in the quiet. I glanced around the clearing, expecting to see a deer or some other animal creeping through the trees, but the forest was empty. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I had camped alone plenty of times before, but as the night deepened, the feeling grew stronger. It wasn't just that something was watching me. It felt like the forest itself was alive, aware of my presence, moving in ways I couldn't see. A snap of a twig behind me made me jump, my heart racing as I spun around. Nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then I heard it again, a soft crackling sound, like footsteps in the dry leaves. The sound was so faint, so distant, that I almost convinced myself it was just the wind. But then it came again, closer this time. And this time it wasn't the wind. I stood up quickly, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife I had strapped to my belt. The fire flickered, casting erratic shadows on the trees, but no matter how hard I looked, I saw nothing but the same dark forest stretching out around me. The feeling that I was being watched was overwhelming now, as if the very air around me was thick with something that didn't belong. I didn't want to overreact. I had been in the woods alone before, and I knew that animals sometimes made strange noises, especially at night. But this felt different. There was something deliberate about the way the sounds were coming closer. Something intentional, something purposeful. The fire crackled again, and I heard a low rustling sound to my left. My heart was pounding in my chest now, my breath shallow as I turned toward the noise. The forest was still, too still. I grabbed a handful of dry leaves and tossed them onto the fire, hoping the smoke would drive away whatever was out there. The wind had died down completely, and the night air had become unnaturally cold. It was like the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of something moving through the underbrush, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was moving with purpose, careful, deliberate. Something was circling me, getting closer. The fire flickered, casting long, spindly shadows across the clearing. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. The sound was louder now, closer. I could almost hear the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustling of branches. But still, I saw nothing. I was completely surrounded by the dark trees, the darkness closing in on me. I backed up slowly, my eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. There was a faint rustling to my left, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the ground. My blood ran cold. I had no idea what it was, but I knew it wasn't just an animal. It was at that moment I realized how alone I truly was. No one would be coming to help. There were no other campers, no rangers out here. Just me in the middle of the forest with whatever was out there. I grabbed my pack and started to move quickly toward the edge of the clearing, the sound of something following me echoing in the still night. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and I had to force myself to stay calm, to think clearly. I couldn't stay here. I needed to get to the trail back to civilization. But every direction I looked seemed to lead deeper into the forest. I made a decision then. I wasn't going to wait around to find out what was out there. I grabbed my tent and rolled it up as quickly as I could, stuffing it into my pack. I didn't bother trying to save the fire. It was useless now. I had to go. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if I was even on the trail anymore. But the sound of something moving just behind me drove me forward, my legs burning with exhaustion as I pushed myself harder, faster. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, the air too thin in my lungs as I crashed through the underbrush, the branches tearing at my skin. I didn't stop, not once. The forest stretched on forever, the trees seeming to press in closer with each step. The darkness was suffocating. My mind was a blur of panic, adrenaline, and the overwhelming need to get away. I stumbled, my feet catching on roots and rocks, but I didn't dare slow down. Finally, after what felt like hours, I broke through the trees and into an open field. The moonlight bathed the grass in a pale, cold glow, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. I could see the trail in the distance, the path that would lead me back to the campsite where I had parked my car. But then I stopped. My breath caught in my throat as I looked back at the forest behind me. The trees stood silent and still, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the leaves. There was nothing following me. No one was out there. I was alone. I made my way back to the trail, my steps slow and cautious, my mind still racing. As I walked, I realized something. The forest had never been the problem. It was me, out there, alone in a place where I didn't belong. The woods didn't care about me or whether I was scared. It was just a place. The fear I had felt was real, but it had come from within me. I was lucky. I had made it out. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was rising. I didn't look back at the forest as I climbed into my car and drove away. It was over. I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching me, waiting. And though I was gone, I knew the woods were still there, as silent and unmoving as ever, holding their secrets in the dark. I had always considered myself an experienced camper. I'd spent countless weekends in the woods, roughing it alone, with nothing but a tent, a sleeping bag, and a fire. But this trip was different. I hadn't been out on a solo trip in a while, and I figured it was time to reconnect with nature, clear my head, and just get away from everything. I found a secluded spot online, a cabin deep in the woods, which seemed perfect, the kind of place that would give me the solitude I craved. The drive out there was longer than I expected. I'd taken the usual mountain road, winding through trees and past rocky cliffs, and then turned onto an old, dirt path that quickly became more and more isolated. The further I drove, the more it seemed like I was stepping off the grid. There were no other cars, no signs of life, and not even any cell phone signal. Just the steady hum of the engine, the occasional bird call, and the wind rustling through the trees. The road was narrow, and I had to be careful with the twists and turns. It was the kind of place where if something went wrong, no one would come to help. Eventually, I reached the cabin. The place looked exactly like the pictures, rustic, old, but with enough character to make it feel authentic. It was small, built with wood, and nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines and thick brush. A small creek ran nearby, barely audible under the hum of the forest. It was perfect, a place to escape and breathe. I parked my car outside, grabbed my gear, and walked up to the front door. The cabin was silent, no sign of anyone else. I opened the door and stepped inside, immediately hit with the musty scent of old wood and dust. Felt abandoned, but in a way that wasn't unsettling. The walls were lined with wood paneling, and there were a couple of pieces of old furniture. A couch, a wooden table, a rocking chair by the fireplace. Felt lived in, but not recently, like it had been left alone for a while. I set my bag down and went about unpacking my things. I didn't need much, just the basics. A sleeping bag, some food, a couple of books, and my trusty pocket knife. I set up my little camp in the corner, near the fireplace, which looked like it had been unused for years. The cabin didn't have electricity, and I was fine with that. I liked the simplicity of it, just me, the fire, and the wilderness. As the day stretched on, I ventured outside. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the trees. I decided to go for a short hike down by the creek. The path was well worn, so I didn't expect to get lost, but I kept an eye on the surroundings. There was something about the quiet here that was different. Most of the time, I would have felt at ease, but there was an undercurrent of something unfamiliar. The creek was beautiful, the water was clear, and the sound of it rushing over rocks was soothing. I walked along its edge for a while, enjoying the peace, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I kept thinking I wasn't alone. It wasn't that I saw anything, but there was something unsettling about the stillness around me. I decided to head back to the cabin before it got too dark. As I made my way back, I noticed a small clearing off to the side of the trail. Something caught my eye. A piece of broken wood, maybe a fallen branch, but it was odd. It didn't look natural. I stepped closer, curiosity getting the better of me, and noticed what it was. A small, old trap. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but the rusty metal was unmistakable. A bear trap. I froze. I knew that traps like this weren't uncommon in the area, but it still felt strange to find one so close to the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't meant for an animal. It was too well hidden, too close to where people might walk. I didn't think much more of it at the time, but my unease grew. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I shook the feeling off, thinking I was just being paranoid, but as night fell, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I lit the fire in the fireplace and settled in for the evening, but every crack of the wood, every gust of wind outside made me tense. I kept my pocket knife close, just in case. The first night passed without incident, but I didn't sleep well. The cabin creaked and groaned in the wind, and the sound of distant animals moving through the woods kept me on edge. I wasn't used to feeling like this in the wilderness, but the isolation, the emptiness, the lack of any human presence. It all seemed too much, too quiet. The next day, I decided to head out again, this time farther down the creek. I figured I could hike the trail to the next part of the forest and maybe get a better lay of the land. I wasn't sure how far I could go before I reached the end of the trail, but I wanted to push myself a little. I walked for hours, the path slowly becoming less defined as I ventured deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, and the underbrush thickened. The light was dimmer, and the air smelled rich with the scent of pine and damp earth. After a while, I noticed something odd. I had been hearing footsteps, light and distant, following me for the last few minutes. I stopped, turned around, and scanned the area. Nothing, just the trees and the shadows. I started walking again, telling myself it was just an animal, but the feeling of being followed wouldn't go away. It wasn't the rustle of animals or the scurrying of small creatures. It was deliberate, like someone was pacing behind me, quickened my pace, my mind racing. I had no idea if I was imagining it, but it felt real. The sensation of eyes on my back was suffocating. I wasn't sure if I should keep walking or head back to the cabin. The thought of returning to that empty place was equally unsettling, but it was starting to feel like the right choice. I made my way back toward the cabin, trying not to look over my shoulder, but the footsteps were still there, just out of reach. When I finally got back to the cabin, I didn't relax. I locked the door behind me, even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. There was no one out there, at least not that I could see. But the thought of someone in those woods watching me made my skin crawl. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside the cabin made me jump. A twig snapping, the wind howling, the creek rushing past. It all felt wrong, like it was leading up to something. The feeling of being watched had only gotten stronger. My nerves were shot, but I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. I was alone in the woods, And that's what the woods did to you. They played tricks on your mind. By the third day, I was exhausted. I had barely eaten or slept. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Every time I stepped outside, it was like something was just out of sight, waiting. The feeling of being followed never left. And the strangest thing was the footprints from the trap. The broken wood kept coming back to me. I couldn't shake the thought that someone else was out there. Someone who didn't want me there. I decided to leave. There was no reason to stay anymore. I packed my things quickly, too quickly. I didn't even bother checking the place one last time. I just needed to get out. I threw my stuff in the car, started the engine, and drove off as fast as I could, heading back down the dirt path. But as I reached the main road, I looked in the rearview mirror, and I swear to God, I saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, just watching. I couldn't make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was a person standing completely still, staring at the cabin. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove all the way home, and for the next few days, I kept wondering what I had missed. What had I felt so wrong about? But I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched, even at home. I would catch glimpses of shadows out of the corner of my eye, hear footsteps behind me when I was alone in my apartment. It was like the forest hadn't let me go. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. Sometimes the woods aren't as empty as they seem, and sometimes the feeling of being watched doesn't go away. I had always loved the idea of solo camping, escaping the noise and chaos of everyday life. The tranquility of being in nature, the feeling of being completely detached from everything else, had always been something I craved. That's why, when I found a secluded spot deep in the woods, miles from any hiking trail, I knew it was the perfect place to get away for a few days. I packed my gear carefully. A sturdy tent, my sleeping bag, food, and a reliable flashlight, just in case. I made sure to bring extra batteries for my radio, although I wasn't planning to use it much. The weather forecast said it would be clear and calm, which only made me feel more confident. I had done this kind of thing before plenty of times, and I was comfortable with the routines. The drive there was long, winding through narrow country roads that eventually turned into rough dirt paths. The trees seemed to grow thicker as I got farther into the woods, their tall trunks casting long shadows across the path. It was already late in the afternoon when I finally reached my destination, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting a golden hue across the forest floor. I parked my truck and took a moment to just stand there. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was perfect. Not a single soul in sight, just me and the woods. Setting up camp was simple. I found a flat area near a small creek, its gentle babbling adding to the peaceful ambience. The ground was soft but firm enough for my tent, so I got to work. It didn't take long to get everything settled: the tent, the sleeping bag, and my campfire ring. I wasn't planning to make a big fire tonight, just a small one to keep things cozy and to help ward off any unwanted wildlife. As night fell, the air grew colder, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the ground. I built a small fire and sat by it, enjoying the flickering warmth. The smell of the burning wood was comforting, and for a moment, I felt completely at ease. I could hear the wind rustling through the branches, and the occasional sound of something scurrying through the underbrush, but nothing that seemed out of place. I sat there for a while, eating my dinner and watching the fire. My thoughts drifted to nothing in particular. It was one of those rare moments of pure relaxation where the world seemed to fade away. Eventually, the fire burned low, and I decided to retire to the tent. The night was quiet now, except for the occasional snap of a twig breaking somewhere in the distance. I zipped myself into the tent and laid down, pulling the sleeping bag tightly around me. The cold air outside seeped in through the fabric, but the warmth of my body kept it bearable. I closed my eyes and drifted off, the sound of the creek lulling me to sleep. I woke up sometime later, my senses suddenly alert. Something wasn't right. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breathing was shallow. The tent was still dark, but I could hear the wind outside, louder now, rustling through the trees. My first instinct was to tell myself it was just a bad dream, but something told me to stay still, to listen. There it was again, a rustling sound, but this time closer. It wasn't the wind. I felt a chill run down my spine as I lay there in the darkness, straining to hear. The sound came again, unmistakable now. Someone or something moving around outside the tent. I held my breath, trying to calm myself, but the pounding in my chest only grew louder. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving deliberately, slowly, like it knew I was inside. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound didn't have the same quality. It was too purposeful. I felt like I was being watched. The noise continued, circling the tent, like something was inspecting it. I paused once, and I held my breath, waiting for the next movement. The air seemed to grow colder, the wind picking up as if nature itself was holding its breath. 2. I tried to reassure myself again. It was probably just a curious animal. But then I heard something else, something much worse. A soft scraping sound, like something was dragging along the ground just outside the tent. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. What could it be? I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the button. I switched it on, but the light was so dim, it barely cut through the thick darkness. I shone it toward the entrance of the tent, my pulse racing. The light flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows. My stomach lurched. I had to know what it was. There was no way I was staying in the tent, not with something out there moving around like that. I slowly unzipped the tent, the sound of the zipper echoing in the night. My breath came in short gasps as I poked my head out, scanning the area with the flashlight. The beam caught nothing but trees and the faint outline of the creek. I stepped out of the tent, the cold biting at my skin. The woods around me were silent now, almost eerily so. I looked around, my eyes wide, straining to see. My heart was racing. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, telling me to turn back, to get in the truck and drive away, but my feet felt frozen. The flashlight flickered again, and then it happened. A shadow darted across the beam of light, so fast, I wasn't sure if it was real. I turned, but there was nothing there. My skin crawled. I was certain someone or something was out there. I quickly turned back to my tent, my breath visible in the air now, the cold making my hands tremble. I needed to leave. I didn't care what it was or who it was. I just knew I had to go. But as I started to move toward my truck, I heard the sound again, the rustling. Only this time it was closer than ever. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was still nothing. Suddenly, I felt something, a movement just behind me, a brush against my jacket. My heart nearly stopped, and I whirled around, my breath coming in sharp gasps. But again, there was nothing, no sound, no sign of anything. For a moment, I just stood there in the middle of the woods, trying to catch my breath. I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or if there really was something out there, but something in the pit of my stomach told me that I wasn't imagining it. This wasn't normal. I bolted back to the truck, scrambling to open the door. I threw my gear in the back, not caring what I was grabbing. I didn't even think about what I was doing. I just needed to get out. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the campsite one last time. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. There was no movement, no signs of anything, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest gas station, far from where I had been camped. I pulled over, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the world. The woods looked peaceful again, but I knew better now. Something was out there, something that wasn't right. I don't know what it was that night. Whether it was a person, an animal, or something else entirely, I don't know. But I do know that I will never go back to that spot. No matter how quiet it seems, no matter how peaceful, there are things in the woods, things you can't always see but can certainly feel. And I learned that lesson the hard way. had planned this trip for months. There was nothing special about the campsite, just a small, secluded patch of land about a mile off the main trail in a forest I had been to several times before. It wasn't a place people usually went. It was quiet, remote, and perfect for the kind of solitude I craved. No cell service, no noise, just the hum of nature and the occasional rustling of an animal. I wanted peace. I wanted quiet. I drove out there alone. It wasn't the first time I'd camped by myself, but something felt different this time. I wasn't sure if it was the unease I'd been carrying for weeks or the fact that the weather was beginning to feel more unpredictable. The forecast had called for clear skies, but there was a faint tension in the air as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I parked my truck at the trailhead and shouldered my pack, which felt heavier than I remembered, but I pushed that thought out of my head. The trail was familiar, winding through the dense forest, the towering trees casting long shadows as the sun dipped lower. The further I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, nothing. The feeling of isolation wasn't unusual, but there was a kind of weight to it this time, a pressure on my chest that seemed to grow with every step. I stopped for a second, trying to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. It wasn't until I reached the campsite that the sense of something being wrong truly settled in. The site itself was nestled between two thick clusters of pines. It had a fire ring, a spot for a tent, and even a small clearing where I could set up my chair and look out at the stream. It was exactly as I remembered it, maybe even a little better. The area was untouched, save for the occasional deer track in the dirt. I set up my tent quickly, starting with the rainfly in case the weather turned. I knew I didn't want to be caught unprepared. The sky had darkened faster than I had expected, and I could already hear the first low rumblings of thunder in the distance. As I lit the campfire, I noticed the strange quietness of the forest. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing but the crackling of the fire. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. I had been alone out here plenty of times before, but tonight was different. The firelight flickered across the trees, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to dance in the periphery of my vision. The air was heavy with humidity, making it difficult to breathe. I could feel the sweat beading on my neck, but I didn't dare wipe it away. The stillness around me felt almost suffocating. The first night went by without much incident, just the usual sounds of the forest settling into darkness. I fell asleep inside my tent, trying not to think about the odd sense of being followed I had felt during the hike in. I had chalked it up to nerves, the kind of nervousness that comes with being alone in the wild. But when I woke up the next morning, something had changed. I stepped out of the tent, stretching and looking around. The sky was overcast, the kind of clouds that tell you the day will be gloomy. But it wasn't the weather that unsettled me, it was the condition of my camp. The fire pit was untouched, but the logs that had been stacked near the tent had been moved, scattered in a half circle around the site. I hadn't touched them when I set up. There was no reason for them to be disturbed. I tried to ignore the feeling crawling up my spine, convincing myself that it was probably just an animal. Maybe a curious deer or something larger had wandered through. But the more I looked at the camp, the more I felt something was wrong. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it felt like someone else had been there. Someone who was careful, who knew how to move quietly and leave no trace. I checked my food supplies, everything was still there. My backpack, my gear, it was all undisturbed. Still, the sense of unease lingered. The day passed slowly, the overcast sky pressing down on everything like a heavy blanket. I spent most of the day on the far side of the camp, fishing at the small creek that ran nearby. The water was low, but I still managed to catch a few small trout, which I cooked over the fire later. As the light began to fade, I noticed something strange. The forest seemed to be alive with noises, scratching, rustling, the distant sound of something moving through the underbrush. But there was something off about it. It wasn't natural. It was as though the sounds were purposeful. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread. I convinced myself that I was just overthinking things. But as the sun disappeared, leaving the forest in near total darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept the fire going, hoping its light would keep whatever it was at bay. I stared into the flames, lost in thought, until a loud crack broke the stillness. Something had stepped on a branch just outside the circle of light. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, another snap, closer this time. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The rustling came again, now unmistakably behind me, just outside the firelight. My breath hitched, and my instincts screamed at me to run, to grab my pack and bolt down the trail. But I stayed still, my eyes fixed on the fire, my mind racing. Then the rustling stopped. I didn't wait for it to start again. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on and sweeping the beam around the clearing. Nothing, just trees and shadows, stretching impossibly far. The air felt colder now, and the weight on my chest was unbearable. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. I couldn't go back to the truck. I couldn't let my fear control me. I sat there, the fire crackling, trying to force myself to focus on the flames and nothing else. But the sounds continued. Subtle at first, branches snapping, something large moving just out of sight. Then, a whisper, faint and distant. It was the sound of something breathing, not a gust of wind, not the rustling of leaves, but a low, deliberate exhale. A breath that didn't belong to any animal I could recognize. I wasn't alone.